is the writing process, and then how to structure and create academic arguments. Because academic writing is actually about creating arguments and convincing your reader of your point of view. And then I'll focus on practical tips, tools, and linguistic devices for better academic writing, and then conclude. And then at the end, there will be time for some questions. I've got quite a number of slides and a lot of information which I would like to present to you. So I'm really looking forward to that. And but I will try and make time, obviously, at the end of the presentation for questions. So if I can go on and firstly start talking briefly about what the difference is between personal writing versus academic writing. We'll see academic writing requires a totally different mindset and a totally different set of practices than normal or personal writing. And I've seen this with so many students, you know, when they start with academic writing texts, they tend to not follow the discipline. They tend to intuitively want to write as they do with just writing a normal essay or letter or, you know, a business document. But there are specific structures and rules, which I'll explain as I go along. And if you can follow that, it actually becomes incredibly easy to structure the documents and to write your text. So as you can see, that firstly, there's a big difference between the sort of formal language in academic writing was informal, emotional tone versus non-emotional, factual, more objective, etc. And it also follows academic writing a more formal introduction, which incorporates a thesis statement, and then in-text referencing, and then also other forms of sort of language, more formal language. So we'll talk about that in much more detail. But academic writing is really characterized by facts, firstly, versus opinions. You can use opinions, but they have to be substantiated. And that is, you cannot simply just write your opinion there. It has to be substantiated. Also, research-based results. You have to prove through research, substantiate your claims. The other point is clarity. It's very, very important that your style of writing and the golden thread that you weave through the document makes your argumentation incredibly clear so that the reader can really understand. Becomes very difficult if it is not clear and the argumentation cannot be followed, and makes it very difficult for the reader. The other characteristic is trustworthiness. Obviously, incredibly important that the evidence you provide can substantiate, and we'll repeat these points over and over again, that your writing is trustworthy and it is believable. And then the transparency of the text structure. So as I'll explain later, your paragraphs follow a particular structure. Your whole document follows a particular structure. So academic writing is different from personal writing. It is also called scholarly writing, or it's also called scientific writing. So it's in a particular way in which it is written. If we just look on sort of the common sense view of writing, you know, we think about writing as spelling, grammar, and punctuation. And I think for many of you, you know, English is probably a second language. So like for me also, my primary language is actually Afrikaans. So writing is a second language problem for many people, but you have to master English to be able to write properly academically in English. And the idea is normally if you can speak it, you should be able to write it, but that's not necessarily true. Academic language is more formal, and you have to actually follow the structures and rules I'll tell you a little bit about. And what is also important is you don't learn and then write the learning, you learn by writing. So you'll see writing is the three-stage overlapping process, and actually in the first phase of writing, which is called pre-writing, you actually learn by writing. You know, you write down your ideas in a sort of very informal manner first in order to crystallize your ideas before you go over to make it more formal. So if we look at academic, the writing style, you must have a point of view that you are able to substantiate with good scientific and objective facts. And then analyzing arguments improves also the understanding of viewpoints and supporting evidence. You must distinguish between facts and opinion. You cannot just write your opinion there. If you write your opinion there, you have to substantiate it with facts. So I always think, and I normally tell my students that, you can either provide evidence in the form of experts or authorities by way of quoting people or, providing their sort of research, or you must, if you want to put your opinion down, you have to argue it. You have to create an argument that will convince the reader of that particular argument. So making judgments about evidence and coming to conclusions are essential in academic reading and writing, and you've got to use the right words, which I'll explain a little bit later. So it's all about logical thinking and also about research. And research follows a logical, systematic, and scientifically proven problem-solving process. So in your studies, obviously your literature study, and also you're going to have to read academic texts in order to understand the context of your study and the environment, in which your thesis is stated. So it's important to understand that these rules apply for you in your writing, but it also applies to the sources that you'll be looking at, the academic articles, the textbooks. And if you understand their structure, then it's easier actually to use that in your literature study. So the first point to make about academic texts and textbooks is they are formal in structure and style. And if you're aware of the structures, it's easier to understand them. So academic texts are likely to firstly have an introduction, which presents what is called the thesis point or the main argument. And as I'll explain a little bit later, if this is very well structured, it actually leads the writer to all the different elements that you have to prove in your thesis. Everything else in the text revolves around this thesis point. So by identifying the main thesis point or argument at the beginning of the reading task, you prepare yourself to look for the subsidiary arguments and supporting details that the writer advances. So what is very interesting is that, and this comes from a South African academic, Professor Kirsten Kraus. He uses the sort of inverted pyramid. He says, while you're writing, you start here. It's very interesting. We call it the inverted pyramid because it becomes more and more focused in your document, and it follows the same structure also in your paragraphs and your chapters. So you move firstly from the known to the unknown. So as you can see, as you start with what is known, and then you identify sort of gaps. As you can see, there's a knowledge gap there. You move towards the unknown. You also move from the general. So in many cases, the problem statement is like a generalization that you state as an assertion, as a hypothesis, and then you move to more to the specific. So in your document, you start sort of with the known, move to the unknown. You also start with the general and move to the specific. You also start with a global and you move towards the local. So that's just very important, I think, the progression throughout the document. And another very important point in terms of academic writing is you must focus on discussing the themes, the claims, the ideas, rather than the authors. I see this is a mistake that many students make. For instance, you can see in this first paragraph, there's just one source that's quoted. So obviously this student copied this text maybe from the source and then maybe rewrote it maybe in their own words. We'll talk about paraphrasing a little bit later. But so this is really author-led because it's only what one person is saying. It's not really an argument. It's not really a conversation. It's not a discussion. Whilst what you need to do is you need to create a conversation or discussion between different authors. And we talk about the discourse. So there's a discourse around this particular point, and you want to follow it. You can see there are many different authors here cited, Kavunja, so forth, Adams. So in the second paragraph, you can see this researcher obviously, is focusing more on sort of claims-led type of, writing than on author-led. So just beware of that. Obviously, If you do the literature research, you have to start with particular writers, but again, you create a conversation between the different authors, and then you've got to find your own voice in that conversation, which I'll talk a little bit later about. But I found this very useful, and I hope you do too, this sort of idea of moving, from the sort of introduction to the conclusion. If you look at the whole construction of your document, it is basically moving from the known to the unknown, from the general to the specific, and from the global, or even lesser known, obviously, to the unknown, and then general to the specific, and from the global to the local. And then it ends with your conclusion and summary. So if we look at the academic style itself, what does that entail? Well, it uses formal vocabulary. So you use different words, and your vocabulary, the words you use, are incredibly important. So you use formal words such as, instead of, you use such as, for instance, instead of the word like, you can say, the person, there are many examples of this, like this. You don't use, that's a more informal word, you use such as. You use, instead of saying, okay, there are lots of different people with this and that, it's a more informal word, you use words like there's a significant number, for instance. And then the other thing, the rules with regards to numbers, you normally write out, instead of using in the text, there are exceptions, but in general, using the number 3, for instance, 1, 2, and 3, up to 10, you would actually use the word. You would write out the word instead of just using the numeric. But then up to 10, then after that, from 11 onwards, then you can use the numbers. So there are all sorts of formal rules like this. The second one is use formal words. Instead of, the stock price went up, you must say it increased, or, was elevated. You use more formal language. You use terms like discuss instead of talk about, improve instead of get better, etc. You use full form of verbs also. You do not use don't, for instance, or I can't, he couldn't do that, or can't do that. You use do not, you actually use the full form. You use formal grammar structures and avoid too many simple sentences. So you would actually combine simple sentences and use formal grammar structures. Use statements and avoid questions. So instead of asking questions like, for instance, what were the reasons behind the decline, rather say there were four main reasons for the decline. So you use more statements. Obviously, there are going to be questions when you get maybe to your research problem, etc. But in general, try and use statements rather than questions. Use impersonal phrases and avoid personal pronouns and adverbs. You don't really talk about I and we, and use words like amazingly and luckily. You use passive voice also, like instead, for instance, the water was heated, in the past tense, so passive voice. You must be incredibly precise and avoid, using vague words like about. For example, instead of saying the turning point was about 30 years ago, you've got to be much more specific and precise in that. You can say, for instance, rather, the turning point was in the late 1980s. You must obviously cite your sources, very important, provide evidence. Also use and avoid plagiarism, of course, which we'll briefly talk about. You also use tentative language and avoid absolute statements. It's very important in academic writing. It's very difficult to be absolutely sure of something. You cannot say that something is exactly like this. You will say, there's a huge probability that it'll be like that. Or, based on the above argument, it is highly probable that. Or you can say, there's a possibility that, or you use sort of tentative language in academic writing instead of absolute. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's called hedging, this technique. Or tool is called hedging in academic language, very important part of it. And you use appropriate transitions and specific words to link sentences, to link ideas, to link chapters, to link paragraphs. You must make the links and make it very clear. Avoid using bullet points. You can use bullet points, but sparingly, because you know, the bullet points don't provide sort of that linkage that you're always looking for. And also words such as and, but, and so. Use more formal words such as a result of, for example, furthermore, in conclusion. I'll show you some of these words a little bit later. But writing actually is a three-stage process. So this is very important. To make it easier for you to write your document, you must find the first phase is called pre-writing. And this is where you write for yourself, not for anybody else. This is finding your own voice, you know, writing down what you want to say. And then after that, there's a process called drafting, where you start writing for others, developing your argument and your sequence of claims. As you'll see in the paragraphs, you have a particular claim, and then you have to provide substantiating evidence and so forth, and then you move on to the next paragraph and so forth. So, and then editing. The technical editing actually occurs right at the end. So there's three phases: pre-writing, drafting, and editing. In this slide, you can see this is from another author. They talk about the pre-writing phase really as the generative writing, where you generate ideas. So, you know, it's really a very creative phase where you generate ideas and you don't care too much initially. You brainstorm basically ideas, and you can write sort of author or article driven. So you can actually, you know, summarize maybe what the one author said, what the other ones. Yeah, and you capture all of this information. So you discover meaning and you write for yourself, and it's really informal writing in many different forms. So you keep a file with all of this information, generating those ideas. And then in the second phase, which is also called drafting on the slide, you'll see this is where the writer then writes for others, you know, where you now start arguing, making sense, putting the arguments together, creating an imaginary conversation, writing and rewriting. And it's very interesting, as you'll see later, in creating an argument. Some of the writers I've consulted, they talk about, you must imagine it like almost a talk show, you know, where you have different speakers talking and you actually put them in a conversation with one another. So very, very interesting in order to, and then you can actually input your conclusions, your opinions in order to create an argument. And then right at the end, the third phase is the editing phase, where you've got the concern for really for spelling, grammar, vocabulary, the technical editing, and also concerns for expectations of the genre. But it's very important, I think, these three different phases. I think what the mistake that many writers make, many students, is to immediately want to jump into phase two, you know, and that's very difficult if you haven't properly done phase one. So think about this. So let's just go in more detail. Yes.
Can I have one question in between?
Yes, sure.
If you go to the previous slide, in the box of drafting,
Yes.
you talk about the imaginary conversation.
Yes.
Can you give us some tips or guidelines on how to do that?
Yes. I think this is where you take the writers and you put them, you know, the sources when you do your literature review, and you put them in an imaginary conversation, and you'll say, you know, Robert Goedegeburen, you know, said this and this and this. This is his point of view, but you know, or as opposed to that, you know, Henry Mason said, you know, this is his opinion, and there's even, you know, another source that suggests this or that, or maybe that comes with a counterclaim, or that takes all of this together and come to a different conclusion. So you actually almost take the different. That's why it's almost like a talk show. You create a conversation between these different authors, where you put them. I have an example somewhere. I'm not. I'll see if I can get hold of it during the process of doing the presentation, and then I can show you a more practical example a little bit later. But it's really like an imaginary conversation. I can, I think when we finish the presentation at the end, I'll get hold of the document quickly and I'll be able to show that to you, do a practical demonstration.
There's a small question, no, not a small question, big question actually, also from one of our colleagues actually at SSM, Han La. She does not agree quite with all of your points. Han, can you maybe illustrate what you mean? I'm looking for Han. Yeah, there she is. Your microphone is off.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I'm in the library, so it's not convenient for me to speak out. Yes. But I mean that in writing up articles, I think that we often use active voice rather than passive voice. So yeah, when I was writing my master thesis, I mostly used passive voice, as you said. But when I switched to a higher level of academic writing, so the active voice is more recommended. Yeah, from my experience, but I'm not sure if you all agree with my point. Yeah, because for example, we like we for example, we confirm our results or something. Yeah.
Okay. I think
so it's not like yeah, we so our argument may be not strong enough to convince the the editors or the readers if you use a passive voice.
Okay, I think these are what I'm talking about, and are not absolutes. Obviously, there are exceptions, and one can deviate from this. These are sort of, in all the sources I've consulted on academic writing is sort of the general type of rules. So, but I don't say that they're absolutes. Obviously, there are exceptions. You can deviate from them. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Robert, I think you asked for an example. There's an example of, if you can see this conversation from Meyer. Yeah, he's got a paragraph here, where he says the conclusions you believe follow from their conversation. So, and then he says almost like a talk show. So this is basically if you separate them. So you say, let's talk about whether our planet's resources can continue to support us. What is your view, Reverend Malthus? And then this sort of source says, I've been warning against this for centuries. So if you look at this paragraph at the top here, and it's just sort of set out in terms of a conversation, then you can see this is actually a good example of how that is done. I will actually, this is a very important article. This comes from a book actually of Meyer, of Wenzel, how to construct and express academic arguments, and I can make this document available also to you. Also very, very interesting, very worthwhile document. So I hope that answers your question, Robert.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. If I can then go on, so pre-writing is the personal space. There's sort of different types of pre-writing tools you can use. I don't know whether you're familiar with Pomodoros.
Excuse me, I can't hear. I'm not sure whether it's myself or everybody.
I think my microphone is on. Can you hear me, Robert?
I can hear it quite well, and so it's maybe your microphone.
Can you all hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay,
Yes, we can.
We can.
Okay, great, fantastic.
We can hear you.
You can go here. I will share my slides with you also, and you can see here, you can click on this link to go to the Pomodoro technique, which is a very interesting technique that you can use in order to write creatively, where you actually write in 25-minute stints. You go and you put a lot of effort in. So this technique, free writing, you can use. You can also use a research journal to promote sort of reflexivity, where you reflect on your own beliefs, judgments, practices during the research process. And then also a reading journal is very important, you know, that you actually write down your, while you're working through your literature sources, to actually create a reading journal. I'll show you more information about that. And then also mind mapping, to draw up like a mind map or an argumentation gap in the end, you know, almost like a systems diagram of, you know, what you want to create and while you're creating it. So the reading journal is really necessary because many students, when they read, they underline keywords, they copy out key quotes, they make notes in the margins, they write summaries, but that doesn't help develop high-level understanding of the concepts or the ability to apply those concepts necessarily. So what you should do is write the full reference at the top of the page and or add the reference, then sit somewhere comfortable to read the text. So do not write anything. Rather focus on understanding rather than remembering, and put the reading aside, and then, you know, ask yourself and write that down. What have I learned? Who says something similar or different? What is there in the text that I still don't understand? What do I think is the key for my own study? So it's just a bit of, you know, a couple of suggestions for keeping a reading journal, which is, I think, a good suggestion. Then after that is the drafting and redrafting. Focus on the coherence. I'll talk about coherence in a little bit more information, the flow in the writing. So what is the golden thread or the central purpose of the text? You know, this golden thread is very important that you take through the whole document. And you also now need to start thinking about the reader and start creating your arguments. This is very important, and keeping the logical flow in mind. So at this stage, you need to ask yourself, is there another way to understand or approach the problem? You know, question, what are the objections to this approach? What people will object? What will be their objections? If alternatives exist, acknowledge it and explain its shortcomings, and do not belittle alternatives. And you can use like post-it notes if you want to on a board to create these flows and arguments and different, because you need to break down your whole document in different chapters, obviously, and different sections, different paragraphs, as you work during this stage. And then the last stage is the editing, proofreading. And this is very important because judgments are made as to the quality of the student's work and even their intelligence based on the surface level correction of their work. Obviously, we all know that, you know, this is the last phase, but if there are spelling mistakes in a document, if there are grammar mistakes and sort of technical mistakes, then if you're an examiner or you're a supervisor, then obviously it reflects sort of badly on the student, I think. So try during this phase, obviously at the end, to keep everything, or the reader keep everything as good as correct as possible. The spelling, grammar, and punctuation, you need to get that right. And the one thing that's very important is consistency. That's what I've learned throughout the document. So in paragraphs, if you've got full stops after each sentence, then it must have throughout the whole document the full, you know, sentence, you know, full stops after each sentence. If you've got your APA referencing in a certain way, you must ensure that it's consistent throughout the whole document. So consistency is of very, very high importance. So don't focus on these sort of surface issues too early, but obviously towards the end, you must get that right. It is very important at the last stage of writing. One tool that you can use if you want an harmony of using it is Grammarly. Grammarly is, you can integrate it with Word also, and the free version doesn't give you access to academic writing, but the paid version does give you, and it's almost like a grammar checker while you're busy typing in Outlook or in Word or whatever, and it'll suggest to you grammatical improvements to your work. So Grammarly you can install if you want. My experience, it works incredibly well. I'm not sure how quick your internet is. Sometimes it can slow down your editing process a little bit. There's a YouTube video also there which explains Grammarly in a bit more detail that you can have a look at. So that brings us then to the issue of how to structure and create academic arguments. And that's really the essence, I think, of academic writing. There's obviously the style and the words and so forth, but it's all about structuring arguments. And there's two levels of this. There's the level at the structural level across and within chapters. So at the higher level, and then there's the structuring of the argument at the micro level per section and so forth. So if you firstly look at the macro level, you can see here your introduction, you know, obviously a lot of people will say you must write really the introduction, sort of, you know, refine it towards the end as well as obviously the conclusion. But as you can see, there is the developing the argument throughout the document, but these are all interrelated because obviously if you look at different levels of interrelationships, for instance, your introduction will reflect, we'll talk a little bit about the literature. Your introduction will talk about the sort of methodology. It'll maybe talks about the potential findings. As you can see, the literature will feature highly in your discussion because in the end, once you've got your results findings, you want to discuss its relevance, you know, and going back to your literature study and so forth. So there's this interplay between the different sections of your document. So at that level, there's got to be that interaction and also very important coherence. So if you look at, we talk about coherence and about cohesion. So coherence relates to the macro level features of the text to make sort of sense as a whole. So it's got to be logically ordered and connected, clear and consistent, understandable at the sort of macro level. But then if we look at the chapters and the paragraphs, the micro level, we talk about cohesion. This is basically that it's sort of united and working together. It fits well. So the words and sentences and how they join and link together, this is called cohesion. So looking at a document, one can judge its level of coherence at the macro level and its level of cohesion at the micro level. So if we look at the micro level of the argument, we can just simply look, and I mean, some of this is very so straightforward and simple, but again, I think it's very important just to go over it again to ensure that we all understand it. So normally an argument is built from a series of knowledge claims that are appropriate to a particular discipline. So the most common argumentative structure is deductive. That means you start off with a generalization or an assertion and then provide support for it. So if you look here, you then provide elaboration of the claims or supporting points, and then each knowledge claim is substantiated by evidence. And often this evidence is the literature, but it could be obviously something else also. It could be research, it could be authorities or so. So the components of your argument are normally your claim, which could be your viewpoint, your thesis, your hypothesis, and then the evidence, support for your claim. And this evidence might take the form of examples, facts, scientific findings, experimental proof statistics, and statements by qualified authorities. And all sources of this evidence must be referenced appropriately. When you think of evidence as developing, explaining, understanding, and illustrating your viewpoint, because the main thing is you need to convince your reader that you are well informed, and you've got to convince the reader of your argument. Obviously, you also have to identify counter arguments because there are going to be other researchers out there that come with counter arguments. You have to acknowledge them, and they obviously have to respond to us, you know, to them also. So very interesting. So this is just one example. So if you look at this example, can anyone tell me what is the major claim in this paragraph? Okay, once you've read it, if anybody can tell me. Okay, anybody?
The economic contribution of
Yes,
the
to me.
automotive industry in South Africa.
Okay, anybody else? I mean, you're correct there, I think, but anybody else? Which specific words?
The specific word is the automotive industry makes an important contribution to the country's economy.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if we look then at this paragraph, absolutely, that is the claim that is made. And you can see here in the different colors, the elaboration of the claims is basically these words that are in blue, as you can see. So obviously the claim is made the automotive industry makes an important contribution. So it is substantiated by the fact that there's exports. It's the third largest industry and it employs these many people, and it also uplifts communities. Now, what is the evidence, for this claim? And as you can see there in green, well, I mean, the reference is black, 600,000 vehicles, which is 60% was exported. And then it contributes 7.7% of GDP, according to this guy, Jordan, and also 4% of the corporate social investment expenditure, according to that source. So as you can see, that is the general sort of structure normally of paragraphs, the micro level, which we'll talk a little bit about, but it includes these three elements. Now, it's very simple if you then ask yourself in terms of your document, what are your exact claims, the elaboration of the claims, and, is it really substantiated by facts? So this is a very simple example, but I think a very good example. So again, the claim is a statement of the primary argument that you're making, or series of claims. It's almost like, we talked about looking at it like a talk show, but these claims can be thought of as the equivalent of a plot for a novel. I mean, if you think about different claims taking you progressively to convince you over a period of time. Supporting points, and then obviously the evidence backs up those, based on facts, research results, and the like. When it comes to evidence, it's very interesting. You see that you must make sure that there's sufficient amount of evidence. It's comprehensive enough. It's current and relevant. That's why in your field, if it's a fast evolving field, you cannot have sources that are like 30 years old. It's got to be relevant, recent sources. The evidence is verifiable, including proper referencing. The authority is dependable and applicable. You must ensure that hopefully, your sources are from peer-reviewed journals and so forth, from verifiable sources. Then also your statistics are trustworthy, applicable, appropriate, and well-researched, and so forth. So there's a big difference between facts and opinion. So in your document, you can have opinions, but then they have to be substantiated. Whilst facts you can obviously quote, but with the necessary sources. So this is a good suggestion. I think the best way to make certain you've thought out an argument in its entirety is to arrange ideas in a pro and cons table, for and against, in which you weigh the arguments, claims, and counterclaims. So the evidence firstly must be based on facts that can be proven. Secondly, you can use expert opinions or quotations based on research generated by authorities or experts, which are referenced. You can use definitions, for instance. You can use statistics and also examples. You can use practical examples, which are clear, concrete, and tangible illustrations, of a particular point. So these are all, different types of evidence that you can use. In your document, in your writing, you obviously want to avoid plagiarism. And in order to do that, you can obviously provide somebody else's ideas, and you use the technique called paraphrasing. It's a sort of accurate, simpler restatement of the content of a piece of text without altering the meaning. But it requires these steps. I don't want to go through these steps now, but as you can see, you can read through the paragraph, without looking, then start sort of writing, break it in longer sentences and so forth. But this is a good, I think, instruction for you how to paraphrase and write it in your own language. You can also summarize, very important, where you want to summarize somebody else's text and shorten it and provide it in a summary form. And then where you have quotations, you obviously have to put them in quotation marks. If the quote is longer than 40 words, then you need to put it in a block quotation indented without marks. So this is an example of that. This is actually from my PhD dissertation. You can see here this definition of a community from the United Nations Development Program was much longer than 40 words. I think it's, I don't know, 60 words or so, 70 words. So that's why it's put. So if you quote a longer piece, then it must be quoted like this. And just have a look at the linking words that are used here, which I'll show you a little bit later. So here I actually criticize this definition. I say it uses geography as a point of departure. The city-town is the larger concept and so forth. No mention is made, however, of the business sector, another omission. So I actually criticize this, provide an opinion, which I then obviously go on and substantiate in the document. So if we look at the elements of an argument, and this is according to Wenzel, I'll give you a copy of this document, which is very interesting. In a simpler form, again, if we can go to that, that's conversation between authors is an argument. We recommend it as an argument because there's an interaction between the views. And you see, so it starts with a claim. There should be an explicit statement of the claim. And then what we have is here the data, the facts or evidence that directly supports the claim, which Tolman refers to as the data, as you can see there. Then we have typically the warrant. That's an explanation of why the data is relevant in support of the claim. And then we also have Q. You can see the extent to which the claim can be accepted, i.e. the qualification of the claim, because it can only be maybe under certain circumstances be accepted. And then also the rebuttal, the conditions under which the argument might not be valid, also called the counter argument or the rebuttal. And the rebuttal can focus on the claim or on the data or on the warrant. So very interesting. So when you look at your document and you look at the arguments you create in your document, I think revisit this and have a look and see how clear your arguments really are. This is just another slide. I'm not going to talk about it, but I've given this to you for easy reference. And this is just another slide on elements of an argument from Tolman. There is actually, it's the same person. You can see, but this is the exact source where you can see all the questions, testing of the claim. What exactly are we discussing? What precisely do we stand on the issue? And what position was we consider, and so forth. So you're very welcome to have a look at this slide also. So in formulating that, it's very interesting. This is how we develop, I think, the argument. You can have a look here and see which is best. I mean, here's the first attempt. This is higher education institutions in South Africa. So attempt 1 is higher education institutions do not prepare graduates to become employable. As you can see, this is a generalization. This is obviously a claim that is made. Okay, now how are we going to take this claim further and substantiate it and provide evidence? So the second attempt is the youth unemployment is 55%, and there's a statistics, South Africa, government department. Higher education institutions do not prepare graduates to become employable. But you can't really, I think, because the youth unemployment rate, and as a matter of interest, it is as high as 55% in South Africa, which is shocking. You cannot say that higher education do not prepare graduates to become employable, because obviously a lot of them do not necessarily go to higher education and so forth. So you need to elaborate more. I mean, that's not good enough. So the third attempt is the youth unemployment is 55%. A quarter of these young people have studied towards the qualification. And then you can say higher education qualification, institutions do not prepare, but still this is not substantial enough. And so you can work through each one of your claims and add substantiating claim, information as well as then evidence. So you can see the sort of last attempt here was much more substantial. It says the youth unemployment rate is 55%. A quarter of these young people have studied towards so and so. So it appears that the higher education institutions play a role You see, it's not an absolute statement. They play a role. It's not because of them towards a qualification and not becoming employable. However, Smith argues that individual characteristics are more important when it comes to determining employability. While this is true, Jones showed that universities can change individual characteristics. This suggests, again, not an absolute statement, that universities are indeed failing their graduates by focusing mainly on conveying generic subject knowledge rather than developing them as individuals. This is just an example of how, you can develop your arguments. So what sort of arguments or claims should be part of a thesis? This is according to Ngwenyama. You can see here that according to this researcher, these are the sort of 10 basic claims of scientific research. The questions must be relevant and persisting in the field of study. The theoretical framework must be appropriate. Research method is appropriate. The empirical situation appropriate for observing the phenomena and so forth. The researcher has demonstrated command of the literature. The researcher has demonstrated command of the literature of the theoretical foundations framework upon which the research is based. The approach and method has been applied in a systematic manner and documented. The results of the research can make a contribution and so forth. And also the ethics. And you must also show your communicative competence. So this is all should be part of your academic writing involved in your putting your document together. You have to develop your
Can
own
I ask
voice.
one question about
Yes.
that one?
Yes.
On the previous slide, well, one of the things that I noticed that the next one. In the second point, there's also always we notice that students are struggling with the theoretical framework and then present something that is, well, as mentioned here, appropriate for investigating the questions that the researcher is intending to investigate. But what would be the guidelines for setting a theoretical framework that is appropriate?
Yes, I think that is a very difficult question. I think that obviously, I think, Robert, you should be able to give better guidelines to us, I think, as far as that's concerned. Because I think the theoretical framework must be investigated first to see what is appropriate to address the specific problem statement or the specific claim that is made. What theories are there out there? What frameworks that can be utilized? For instance, when I did my PhD, I did it on the international relations between South African communities with other communities in the rest of the world, in the sort of field of sister cities, in the field of twinning, of cities across the world. And what was interesting is there was very little research done in that field. But I suggested that this type of relationship could be formulated, could be seen as a strategic alliance between different communities. And in the private sector, there's a lot of information and research done on strategic alliances. So I suggested that theoretical body of knowledge developed in that field could be possibly applied, to this field. So that is, I think, I looked at the theoretical frameworks there and developed a model based on that. Does that answer your question? Not fully, I suppose.
No, yeah, well, not. I was also thinking back of one of the previous slides in which you talked about the warrant and the rebuttal and so on.
Oh,
okay. Could we somehow make a link between what you mentioned here about the theoretical framework and those guidelines that you I forgot the name of the author, Tolman or something.
Tolman.
Yeah, Tolman.
Tolman. Yeah. That is the structure of an argument. I think that is not so much, the theoretical framework. It's more just the structure of an argument. So, but obviously, if you look at theoretical frameworks that are appropriate for investigating the question, one will first have a look, I suppose, to look at what theories are out there, in the sort of realm of knowledge that you're talking about, and then look what other authors, what theoretical frameworks have they utilized to see which ones of those might be appropriate for you, I think.
I think Henry has a question.
Okay, Henry, yeah.
Yes, good afternoon. I would also to ask you to develop a little bit that problem of research framework, because indeed quite a lot of students are a little bit in difficulty at this stage, and often it happens like a white rabbit coming out of a wizard hat. And this is not what we expect in a doctoral thesis. What do you think about once you have made your research journal, you try to make a kind of database where you put in categories the author, the reference, the method used, the causes, the effects that come in a paper, and then trying to crunch all that with systemic analysis and trying to make a kind of elaborated mind map from there, and trying to see if this fits with the initial description given the introduction chapter, because often we see that the
So you disappeared there a little
what
bit.
is the goal in chapter 1, and this is not coherent, of course.
Yes. So what is the exact question, Henri? Is it? I would think that a student has to do all of that you described.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So what's the method you recommend to do it exactly? So you have the narrative describing what is being done, and arguments, critical reading of the literature is of course important. But then,
yes,
when you come at the end of that, how do you come to your conceptual framework, theoretical framework, and then to the research framework? For example, to the model that you want to use to go further.
Yes. I would think that obviously based on your literature study, you will have a look at, there's obviously also, I think, a difference between your research framework and your theoretical framework. You would have a look at what other authors have done in the field, what theories are applicable. For instance, I've always worked in the field of marketing, is sort of my specialization field. So there are all sorts of different theories in that domain. And, you would then obviously cover them in your literature study, and then say specifically which ones of those theories you're going to use, and you would use them to develop sort of the framework for your study, which then your research framework will be deduced from. Yes. But
you don't have a specific method to recommend?
Unfortunately, I don't have. No, I actually, that's why I obviously in this presentation, I tried to focus just on the academic writing part, not so much on, the structuring of the thesis and the research framework and the theoretical framework itself. Maybe one should have a separate session on that, Robert, from somebody who's an expert in that field.
Actually, we were planning to have this type of questions also in one of the next sessions by the person who just asked the question.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for the time being for this answer. Thank you. Okay, I don't want to take too much of the time with this specific question. Thank you.
Pleasure. Okay, so it's important also as you're writing. Again, as I said, I'm trying to focus on the on the writing part, to use this idea of the argumentation that talk showed. You must also develop your own voice. And we said in the beginning that you shouldn't be using words such as I and we and so forth. But one, as it was suggested by somebody else, also one of the students, I think you must develop your own voice, sort of your own words. You put them in a conclusion, but then you have, you include your own voice, basically, as you're talking, your opinion substantiated then. So this is a slide on the importance of counter arguments, of course. When critiquing those who disagree with you, you can focus on either their claim that they're making, maybe you suggest it's false, or the qualifier that their claim could be too strong or their claim could be weak. Or at the warrant, you could be that they're drawing the wrong conclusions from the evidence, or you could focus on their data, that the data may be, and this is one element that I see a big problem with in academic research, is where sample sizes are simply too small, where, and that is quite easily, criticizable. Robert, it's interesting. I saw an article, I think 2 weeks ago, that looked at, I think, a longitudinal type of literature study that looked at all the research done in the field of psychology. And what they tried to do is they at random picked different studies that were done, and then they tried to replicate them. Because, I mean, that's very important scientific research, is you should be able to replicate and get the same results, isn't it? So particularly if it's a peer-reviewed, scientifically based study. And they found in this sort of study that 50% of the studies that appeared in peer-reviewed scientific journals in psychology could not be replicated exactly. There are some caveats as far as that's concerned, but it's just an interesting thought that small, sample sizes, I think, plays a big part in that. The method, you can actually criticize the method also that was used by the author. And you can criticize those with whom you disagree in your own voice, and this may not come across as credible, so you've got to use maybe other authors to criticize the people you don't agree with. So it's important also in your document, as you're writing it, to show who's doing what. So you've got a signal when others are talking, such as Smith so-and-so states that, and then your own voice. You can say, my own view, however, is that this and that, as I said. So it's not absolutely that you mustn't use words like I, we, and so forth, but particularly in sort of a PhD, DBA type of study, you can use your own voice, and you must show it actually. So when summarizing, try to understand not only the content, also the spirit. And here are some of the type of words you can use to signal. So, for instance, verb signaling that the author is making a claim. It's argue, it can be emphasized, that can be reported, can be stressed, for instance, asserted. So these are the sort of formal words. Verb signaling that the author is agreeing. You can say that this person endorsed that one, this person acknowledged, support, conceded, and so forth. And then verbs that signal that the author disagrees. So things like doubt, reject, this person rejects that person. And then verb signaling the author is making a recommendation. This person put forward, this person urged that, recommended that, proposed that, suggested that. So there are all these, words that you can use, which is very important to signal who's doing what. Just some practical tips. The first is basically, you must ensure that your ideas flow in a logical order. I mean, that's absolutely critical. Good structuring of ideas flows. I've been mentioning that all along. And in this case, this is why it's so important. We talk about advanced organizers. It's a structural device that can be strategically used. So in each paragraph, there's a topic, sentence, supporting evidence, concluding statement. So an effective thesis suggests the essay's direction. So you say beforehand what you're going to do. So you put the emphasis, for instance, the reasons and evidence and the scope and so forth. You put it basically, in your thesis statement. The thesis statement is like a mini outline for the rest of the manuscript. As you can see here, this thesis statement, widely ridiculed as escape reading, romance novels are important as proving ground for many never before published writers and more significant as showcases for strong heroines. This is the thesis sort of statement, the claim that's made. But if you look at, the words that are used, you actually organize your whole next sort of section according to this statement, because you now have to write about escape reading. You have to write about never before published writers. You have to write about strong heroines. You can see, so there's normally the structure is the introduction like that, where you have your thesis statement, and then you have your body, and then you have your conclusion, review of the major points. So this is basically how you organize, at the sort of chapter, at the paragraph level. And this is very important. We talk about the you know, the sentence, the topic sentence. So normally you will find that each paragraph, the first sentence, not always the first sentence, but in most cases, the first sentence is the topic sentence, and that is the claim that is made. And everything else and followed in that paragraph is then basically, you know, to substantiate and provide evidence for that point. So there are also these transitional words, linking words that are used, and I'll show you some of these words. So if we look at a paragraph, a typical paragraph contains approximately 50 to 200 words. The principal thought or main idea is usually presented and what's referenced. Again, this is not an absolute. I'm just talking in sort of in general terms. And the topic sentence is in many texts the first sentence of the paragraph. So as you can see here, there's the topic sentence, key topic, then there's the development of the idea, examples, and then the summary. So we can go and have a look at, it's quite interesting if you go to all these links that I've given you. I know there's a problem with this one particular link, so I just want to make sure that I get to the correct place as far as that's concerned. Let me just get to that in a second. Yeah, writing paragraphs there because it actually points to the wrong place there. So as you can see here, all these linking words that are used. So you can see there, the first sentence provides an overview of the paragraph. You can see there here in this sentence, the rest provides, this is the topic sentence. There's currently an ongoing debate in primary education about the role of classroom assistants within schools. That's the topic sentence. That is the claim that's made. And then you can see further on, signaling phrases are used to connect the other parts of the paragraph. Words like, for example, and however. And then there's signaling. The sentence usually start with known information and then provide new information. So you can see this trend, change of focus, for instance. And then you can have a look in terms of the flow. You use other words here, this change of focus, this trend, and then cohesion. You can also see is important. These cohesive links may be used as anaphoric nouns, this trend, and they're also then other different nouns. But I just wanted to point to you quickly the importance of the topic sentence and the words, then the linking words. So again, just as a paragraph, you can see again, very simple paragraph, the topic sentence, the first one here, corporate social responsibility can generate a positive reputation for a company leading to possible more sales and growth. I mean, that is a generalization, there's a statement, and then you start providing the evidence and the substantive, and then at the end, you come with a conclusion. Overall, the evidence seems to suggest that investing in CSR can improve brand image and productivity. So it actually follows that exact example. Other linking words, you know, which can be used to join ideas, sentences, and paragraphs are, for instance, these. You can see they can strengthen the quality and structure of your work. So if you want to show cause and effect, you can use words such as consequently, as a result, thus, hence, and so forth. Comparing and contrasting, alternatively, however, and so forth. Describing similarities, equally, likewise, emphasizing additionally or examples to illustrate, clarify. This is one thing I've seen, for instance, if you want to show progression, you can say, firstly this, and then you write, and then you say, secondly this, and then, but if you have a second paragraph or a second section, then don't write firstly, secondly, and thirdly again, then use different words. Otherwise, you know, it becomes incredibly repetitive and confusing. So showing limitation or contraction, on the contrary, nevertheless, and so forth, and then concluding at the end to summarize, as can be seen, ultimately, as described, finally, and so forth. So you can see these are not necessarily all the words. There are many more words. These are just basically examples. As you can see on this slide, there are even more words, and there's a very good source here, this Purdue University link. We'll find a lot more words, but furthermore, in addition, you can have a look at these additional words. And then you have to balance your claims with evidence. Otherwise, we talk about wobbling. You need to examine your claims for weaknesses and substantiate them maybe more differently. or try to limit your claim. If you can't prove your claim very strongly, then you must limit it through academic hedging, as we said, by making, the claim a bit more vague. So this is what hedging is about, or vague language. And you can see, if you look at the following sentence, for instance, the commitment to some of the social and economic concepts was less strong than it is now, versus it may be said that the commitment to some, you can see here you're making sort of a statement, and here you suggest that may be said, you're actually making it a bit more vague. And now there is a bit of a contradiction in that, because we say on the one hand, academic language must be factual, it must be very precise, it must be specific, and so forth. But on the other hand, we're now saying, it should be more vague. But I mean, the vagueness is actually factual, because if you cannot absolutely prove it, you can say, well, it can be suggested, or, you actually are more precise by being vague. I know that sounds like a bit of a contradiction. So hedging limits your commitment to a claim. X is true. You cannot say that. Maybe if you've got the evidence, you can say it, absolutely. But if you cannot, then you can say X may be true, or it could be the case that X is true, or arguably X is true. So it acknowledges sort of a wobble in the claim.
Can
So I
ask
think
one question
yes,
to you?
yes.
Yeah, about academic hedging, is that also a matter of personal preference, also preference between several supervisors that our students may have, because one supervisor may very much dislike the habit of hedging, while the other one is actually more careful than the other. And just as an anecdote, but when I was doing my PhD, my supervisor and I were quite enthusiastic about some of the results that we got on the impact of internationalization to the Dutch economy. And then we were so enthusiastic that we thought, well, let's make an article and send it to the Economist. As kind of academics, we use a lot of hedging, and we try to be careful not to draw too strong conclusions. And then the article came back with the typical slogan of the Economist, said, well, this is not acceptable to the Economist, because if you want to publish in our journal, you have to exaggerate and simplify. That was the main message. So no vagueness, but make it bigger than it actually is, and leave out all the air, let's say. And then we thought, well, I think in a sense, many of us like it that way. We read magazines like The Economist, because they are so straightforward in whatever they claim, and that makes it very nice to read. And if you start using academic writing and hedging, to many it becomes too vague. Is there a kind of middle ground, or is it you can use either approach, but it's also a personal thing? What do you think?
I think obviously, I think scientists want to present the truth as far as possible, and therefore you cannot claim that something is so if you're not absolutely certain. So that's why you use hedging to say it's possible that there's. If you think, for instance, about the big problem of correlation versus causality. I mean, that's one of the big, I think, in scientific research, because it's easy to prove correlation, but, causality is a much more. So you can suggest that maybe, because something is correlated, there could be causal relationships, but you cannot say it out and out, because there could be so many other factors that influences this particular phenomenon. So I think, but I think the endeavor of every researcher is to go towards using as little hedging as possible, to be as close to certainty, obviously, as possible. But it is in many cases very difficult. So I wouldn't actually. That's why I say there's a bit of a contradiction in terms of using vague language, because we want to be factual, we want to be very specific, we want to be able to prove things beyond any doubt. But it is in many cases quite difficult to do that. So yes, so I think the the aim is to be to use as little hedging as possible, but unfortunately it's not always possible. If there's too much hedging, then obviously you can say, well, you didn't provide enough evidence. I mean, you know, this is much too vague. You know, you must go and find more evidence to prove your point, I would think.
Yeah, clear.
So Robert, I think that's more or less the slides, you know, that I had to present some practical tips on, and I hope I succeeded in this endeavor to give you just some practical ideas, you know, the structure of an argument, and to make it more clear, because I think once students understand just the structure more or less, they understand some of these tools that I presented and tips, I think, you know, it makes it a lot easier to read academic texts and also then to write academic documents. This is just a suggestion I had maybe for the follow-up session. I'm not sure. I thought that maybe students can prepare some slides, but it's basically up to you in terms of the instruction you want to give. You know, to identify what new knowledge they've acquired about academic writing from the session, and to illustrate with examples how they've implemented this knowledge and what changes they've made to their texts. These were just sort of some suggestions. But I think we're open now to not only questions, but also contributions from anyone else. I mean, what additions to what I've said, you know, what else can you share with your fellow students and colleagues that would help?
I think we have one contribution from Francis Munkani. Francis.
Yeah, thank you, Klaus. I have a question. In the section of literature review, which is better, either to paraphrase what you are quoting, which you may risk losing the meaning, or keeping the text as phrased by the author?
I think the idea of paraphrasing is you don't lose the meaning. You actually you know, take it, but you rewrite it in your own words, but you keep the meaning. So it all depends. Sometimes it is you know, if somebody says something distinctively, and it's very short and powerful, and it's difficult for you to paraphrase or whatever, you can quote the person directly. But the idea with paraphrasing is that you keep the meaning. You just basically rewrite it in your own words.
Yeah, I think we if I can add to that, we always try to make students avoid using citations, because it's also a challenge to you as the researcher, as the student who is working on a certain theme and topic, and then research on that theme, to use your own words in interpreting what others working on the same topic before you have told about that topic. And if you just cite that person, then you don't add much to understanding. But to have your understanding to what somebody else has already said using his words or her words, that by itself is already contribution. So paraphrase, I would say, to the maximum extent, and only use citations if really a person has something so remarkable, like Martin Luther King, I have a dream. Those are the things that you cannot easily paraphrase, of course. But in all other cases, try to use your own wordings to interpret it, what you make of what others have told about that topic. There's a question from Mira. Mira, can I invite you? Mira? Mira raised her hand, but I cannot see or hear what she has to say. No? Are there other questions to Cozy or?
I think Francis's hand is up. also?
Francis, I think he forgot to lower his hand.
Okay. Any comments,
Mira,
side questions?
yeah, Mira has a question, but she is going to type it, I think, in the chat because. Yes, please, Mira. If you can type your question, then we can read with you.
Okay, we're waiting for Mira's typing.
Okay, my question is, in the conclusion of a research, how do we word in such a way that industries understand our language? How do we word in such a way that industries understand our language? I think that's a very relevant question, especially for those doing a more professional type of research.
Okay, would anybody like to give a suggestion there? Obviously, there are certain terminology that's used in certain industries. I mean, you know, that is, if you write about research in the financial services industry, there are particular words that are used. I worked in financial services. When I entered that industry first, I didn't know, you know, you've got to understand all the technical terms for, you know, overdrafts and personal loans and, you know, all the abbreviations for all those things and, you know, a lot of technical terms. So obviously your conclusions must then also be made in such a way that it's applicable to your industry. But also I think the language throughout your whole document should illustrate or should reference those particular terms. And maybe there should be an explanation of terms at the beginning of your document also.
Does that answer your question, Mira? And now Mira has to start typing again, of course. Yeah, she says, thank you. So I presume that she's satisfied with this answer. Henry still has a question or contribution. Henry?
Yes. Yes, okay. My question concerns paraphrasing and plagiarism. You clearly suggest to rewrite any key idea or key conclusion from a paper, but an alternative is to put between quotes and in italic the sentence if the sentence is very strong. Do you accept that, or do you think that's well, this can lead to problem when you use anti-plagiarism software, because of course you will face a high hit of coincidences. Or do you suggest to handle that? You are completely against quotes in italic, or you can accept a few ones, or what's your position about that?
Robert, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, well, as I said, our strong preference is that you use as little quotations as possible. Only when it's really unavoidable in exceptional cases, when you really the words of the original author are so strong and so telling that any paraphrasing would decrease the power of what the guy has said, then I would say use quotations. But in all other sentences, in all other examples, I would avoid it to the maximum extent, and then you automatically avoid that plagiarism reports come up with high scores, unless of course you plagiarized without using the citation marks. Yeah, that will be my strategy, but yeah, it's also a bit dependent on the topic, I think. Yeah, some hands are still raised, but I think those people forgot to lower the hands, and then we have come to the 90 minutes that we were having at our disposal. So I would like to thank everybody present today. I would like to especially thank Cozy for giving this introduction. The next steps will be that Cozy will share at least the PowerPoint presentations, but the PowerPoint presentations also has a lot of references in them, I think, which are quite useful, and maybe also some articles and examples on how to do things. We will collect those materials. We will put it on our e-learning platform and share the link to that e-learning platform with all of you, so that you have a great first point of reference to review what you have to do when you start writing your thesis. Second thing, then for the next session, we will also give a bit of summary of what I already said at the beginning. The next step is that we would like to have a couple of examples to somehow make from your questions and the input that you give us, and maybe some parts of the things that you have already written for your thesis. If you give that to us to get some individual feedback, and we will in the process also make a list of typical challenges that we think are present in many theses, and which really have to be addressed. And then that top 10 will be the basis for the follow-up session on 16 November, if I'm correct. So then, yeah, we would like to see all of you come back, and then we can do it less as an introduction and more of an application of what Cozy has, the information that Cozy has provided us with today to put you on track of writing the perfect thesis or the perfect article for publication. So once again, thank you very much all, especially Cozy. Thanks very much. And then we will let you know, hopefully before the end of the week, where you can find all the materials that have been presented today. Okay?
Been a pleasure and good luck with all of your writings.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Good. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.